The moment Sarah Hale stepped off the stagecoach in Redemption Creek, Texas, her dress caked with 3 days of trail dust, and her heart carrying the full weight of a life she was desperately trying to outrun, a man on the other side of the street caught her eye and looked away so fast it was almost insulting. She told herself she did not care. She told herself a great many things in those first hours in Redemption Creek, none of which turned out to be true. It was the spring of 1874, and the town of Redemption Creek sat at the edge of the Texas hill country, like something the land itself had coughed up and not quite finished deciding about. There were 2 saloons, a general store, a livery stable, a church that leaned slightly to the left, and a sheriff's office with a door that never fully closed. The main street was packed earth, rutted deep by wagon wheels, and when the wind came down from the north it carried the smell of cattle and cedar and something wild that Sarah could not name but felt in her chest like a second heartbeat. She was 24 years old. She had come from St. Louis, Missouri, where she had spent the last 6 years working as a seamstress in a dress shop owned by a woman named Mrs. Calloway, who had been kind enough until she discovered that Sarah had been quietly teaching the laundry girl to read using the Bible Mrs. Calloway kept on the windowsill for appearances. Sarah had not been fired outright. She had simply been told that her particular kind of trouble was not welcome, and she had taken the hint with her chin raised and her savings sewn into the hem of her traveling skirt. She had no plan when she bought the ticket to Redemption Creek. The town was simply the farthest the money would take her, and there was a certain poetry in the name that appealed to her stubborn streak. The man who had looked away was Marcus Turner. He was 31, tall in the way that comes from hard work rather than simple height, with dark hair that needed cutting and hands that told the story of 10 years working land that did not give itself up easily. He ran a cattle ranch about 4 miles east of town, a modest operation he had built from almost nothing after arriving in the county in 1866 with a single horse, $40, and the kind of silence that sits on a man who has seen war and decided not to speak of it again. He was not unfriendly. He was simply contained, like a river that had learned to stay inside its banks. The reason he had looked away when Sarah stepped off the stagecoach was not indifference. It was the opposite of indifference, and it frightened him enough that he shifted the weight of his grain sacks onto his opposite shoulder and walked with great deliberate purpose toward the livery stable without once looking back, which cost him considerably more effort than lifting the grain had. Sarah Hale, for her part, was focused on finding somewhere to sleep that was not the stagecoach. The woman she needed to find was Clara Booth, who ran the town's only boarding house on the north side of Main Street behind the post office. Clara was a widow of 50 with arms like a blacksmith and a laugh that made dogs bark 2 streets over. She had been corresponding with the dress shop in St. Louis for months about the possibility of hiring a seamstress, because the women of Redemption Creek had money from cattle now and wanted something to show for it, and Clara Booth had elected herself the person to provide it. Sarah found her without difficulty. Clara was standing in the middle of the boarding house parlor rearranging furniture that probably weighed more than Sarah did, and she looked up when Sarah came through the door and said, "You must be the girl from St. Louis. You're thinner than I expected. Sit down before you fall down, and I'll get you something to eat." It was, Sarah thought, the most direct welcome she had ever received, and she sat down with something that felt dangerously like relief. Over a plate of salt pork and cornbread, Clara explained the arrangement. Sarah would have a room on the 2nd floor. She would set up her sewing work in the small room off the parlor that currently stored boxes of old hymnals. She would pay a portion of her earnings to Clara for room and board. The women of Redemption Creek and the surrounding ranches would come to her for dresses, mending, alterations, and whatever else required needle and thread. Clara made it sound entirely sensible, and Sarah, who had not had anything sensible happen to her in longer than she could comfortably remember, agreed to every word. "There's one thing," Clara said, and her voice shifted into a register that suggested the real conversation was beginning. The social life in this town runs through the church on Sunday and the general store on Saturday. You'll need to show yourself at both if you want the business. People here are not suspicious of newcomers exactly, but they like to know who they're dealing with before they hand over their good fabric. I understand, Sarah said. There's also a harvest dance in 6 weeks, Clara said, and the look on her face was the look of a woman who has decided something and is simply waiting for the rest of the world to catch up. You should come. Everyone comes. I'll keep that in mind, Sarah said, which was not a yes but was not a no either, and Clara Booth accepted it with the calm of a woman who had considerable experience winning arguments through patience. Sarah's first Sunday at the Redemption Creek Church introduced her to approximately 37 people whose names she struggled to retain, 3 children who pulled at her skirt with sticky hands, and Marcus Turner, who was standing at the far end of the church steps speaking to a man she later learned was the town's sheriff, a stocky red-faced man named Dale Prout, who had the air of someone who solved problems by standing near them until they went away. Marcus Turner in daylight was no less alarming than Marcus Turner across a dusty street, which Sarah found inconvenient. He had cleaned up for Sunday, his dark hair somewhat tamed, wearing a plain white shirt and a dark vest and boots that had been recently polished. He was in the middle of some serious conversation with the sheriff, and his brow was furrowed in a way that made him look like a man carrying several competing thoughts at once. He noticed her at precisely the same moment she tried to stop noticing him, which resulted in a half-second of absolute mutual recognition that both of them immediately looked away from, in different directions, with the concentrated nonchalance of 2 people pretending to find opposite walls deeply fascinating. Clara, standing beside Sarah with the satisfied expression of a woman watching a plan unfold exactly as she had hoped, said, "That's Marcus Turner. He has the Running M ranch east of town. Good man. Keeps to himself mostly. Lost his partner about 2 years ago, his ranching partner fellow named John Greer, pneumonia. He's been running the place alone since." "I wasn't asking," Sarah said. "I know you weren't," Clara said pleasantly, and took her arm to introduce her to the pastor's wife. The first time Sarah and Marcus properly spoke was 4 days later, a Tuesday morning, at the general store. Sarah had come in for thread and needles, and a particular shade of blue wool she needed for a dress she was making for the rancher's wife, a pleasant woman named Mrs. Aldridge who had specific opinions about the color of cornflowers. The store was kept by a man named Pete Haverty, who had the gift of knowing where everything was while appearing to know nothing at all. Marcus was at the counter when Sarah came in, waiting for Pete to calculate a receipt for seed and wire. He turned when the door opened, because it was the habit of a man in the West to know who was entering any room, and when he saw it was Sarah, he did that thing again where his face went very carefully neutral, and then slightly less neutral than he intended. "Morning," he said. "Good morning," Sarah said, and moved toward the sewing supplies with the focused air of a woman who had somewhere to be. Pete Haverty looked between them with the undisguised interest of a man who had very little entertainment available to him. "You're the seamstress staying at Clara's," Marcus said. It was not a question, but it was not unfriendly either. It had the quality of a man who has decided to be sociable and is executing the decision with some caution. "Sarah Hale," she said, not turning from the thread rack but hearing the correctness of her own name settle something in her. She had been other things to other people in St. Louis. Here she could simply be herself. "Marcus Turner," he said. "I know," she said. "Clara mentioned you." Something in his posture shifted slightly. "She mentions most people," he said, and there was the very beginning of something in his voice that might, under favorable conditions, become humor. Sarah turned then because she was not a woman who could conduct a conversation with her back to someone and pretend it was normal. She looked at him directly, which she suspected people did not do with him often because he seemed momentarily uncertain what to do with it. "She did say you were a good man," Sarah said. For whatever that's worth coming from me, I've known you about 30 seconds. About 35, Marcus said, and that was it. That was the whole of it. But Pete Haverty later told his wife it was the most interesting thing he had witnessed in the general store since the time a rattlesnake had come in through a crack in the foundation and disrupted the Saturday morning card game. And his wife told Clara, who smiled to herself and said nothing to anyone. The weeks that followed settled into a rhythm that Sarah had not expected to find so quickly. She worked in the little sewing room from early morning until the light went, making dresses and repairing shirts and fashioning curtains for the hotel that had been under construction since before she arrived. The women of Redemption Creek came to her one by one, and then in small clusters, and she learned their names and their stories with the particular attention of a woman who had learned that people are their own most interesting subject, and you only have to give them space to prove it. She learned that Mrs. Aldridge had come west from Georgia 20 years earlier and still cried at the smell of magnolia, though magnolias did not grow in Texas. She learned that the banker's wife, a young woman named Rose Teller, was desperately lonely in the way that only the very rich in small towns can be, because loneliness with money is still loneliness. She learned that the sheriff's sister, a large, quiet woman named Agnes Prout, had a talent for embroidery that she pursued in strict secret because she thought it would make her seem less serious. And she learned gradually, through the pleasant gossip of fitting rooms, that Marcus Turner was a man the town had a great deal of respect for and some degree of puzzlement about. He had come after the war, that much everyone knew. He had worked himself nearly to death building the Running M, and he had done it with a quietness and a self-sufficiency that people admired while also finding slightly exhausting. He was generous when generosity was needed. He had once ridden 8 miles in a February snowstorm to help a neighboring family whose barn had caught fire, and had stayed 2 days helping them rebuild without being asked twice or once. He did not drink to excess. He went to church more out of genuine faith than social obligation, which Clara said you could tell by the way he sat, which was attentive rather than enduring. He had not, in the years he had been in Redemption Creek, shown any serious interest in a woman. Not for lack of opportunity, Rose Teller said, during a second fitting for a dinner dress, her voice carefully casual in the way of someone who is saying more than they appear to be saying. Several women have tried. Martha Higgins went so far as to bring a pie to his ranch. He thanked her very kindly, Clara says, and that was the whole of it. Men have their own timelines, Sarah said, pinning a seam with calm precision. Some men are waiting for the right reason to have a timeline at all, Rose said. Sarah did not respond to this, which Rose interpreted correctly as not a disagreement. Marcus, for his part, kept encountering Sarah Hale in the entirely ordinary ways that a small town provides, and found each encounter leaving him slightly off balance in a way he could not address, because it did not fit into any category he had previously identified as a problem. She was at the church social, where she helped organize the food tables with the same quiet efficiency she seemed to bring to everything, and she laughed at something the pastor said, and it was a real laugh, full and sudden, not the modulated polite laugh of a woman performing at an occasion. She was at the general store again on a Thursday, in a disagreement with Pete Haverty about whether he had actually ordered the specific thread she had requested 3 weeks earlier, and she was conducting the disagreement with complete composure and absolute precision, not angry, simply correct, and Pete was unraveling in real time under the gentle weight of her certainty. She was in the street one afternoon when the Aldridge boy, who was about 8 years old and had more energy than direction, came barreling out of the alley on a horse that was going considerably faster than the situation warranted, and Sarah stepped aside with a calm that suggested either great reflexes or a complete peace with whatever happened next, and then she called something to the boy, sharp and clear, that made him actually rein in the horse, which was more than most adults had managed. Marcus had witnessed each of these moments from varying distances, and with varying degrees of pretense that he was doing something else, which was a new experience for a man who was generally straightforward with himself about most things. He finally did something about it on a Friday evening, 3 weeks after she had arrived, when he came into town to pick up supplies and saw her sitting on the bench outside Clara's boarding house with a piece of mending in her hands. In the golden late afternoon light that the Texas hill country produces in late spring with an almost aggressive beauty, her brown hair coming loose from its pins. And he stopped walking and stood on the street and said to himself, with a plainness that surprised him, that he was going to go speak to her. He crossed the street. "Evening," he said. She looked up from her mending without startling, as though she had known he was coming. "Evening." He stood for a moment with his hat in his hands, which was not something he did often, and said, "I wanted to ask if you might want to walk with me Sunday after church. There's a part of the creek about half a mile east. The water's running clear this time of year. It's a nice walk." Sarah looked at him for a moment, and he did not look away this time, and what she saw in his face was the thing she had suspected was there from the beginning, which was a great deal of feeling being held with considerable effort, like a door that is kept closed not because there is nothing behind it but because there is too much. "I would like that," she said. The Sunday walk was the beginning of everything real. The creek was exactly as he had described it, running clear and fast over smooth limestone, lined with cypress trees whose roots gripped the banks with visible determination. The air smelled of cedar and water and the faint, warm sweetness of the hill country in late spring. They walked along the bank and talked, and the talking came easier than either of them had expected, not because there was nothing to navigate, but because they were both people who meant what they said and found pretension exhausting. He told her about the running M, about how he had come to Texas after the war, which he mentioned briefly and without embellishment, the way a man mentions a place he has been that changed him, but that he does not intend to take up permanent residence in through memory. He told her about the land, about the particular quality of early morning on the ranch when the mist came up from the creek hollow, and the cattle moved through it like dark shapes in a painting. He told her about building the house himself over the first 2 years, how he had learned what he knew about carpentry from necessity rather than instruction, and how the bedroom door still did not hang quite straight and probably never would. She told him about St. Louis, about the dress shop and Mrs. Calloway and the laundry girl, whose name was Bess, and who had been 14 and quick as lightning when it came to reading, and who had written Sarah a letter 2 months after the incident saying she was now working in a millinery shop where the owner was a more progressive woman, and Bess sent her love and her thanks. Sarah told it without self-pity, which Marcus found to be one of the more striking things about her, this absence of self-pity, because she had reasons for it and chose against it anyway. "Why Redemption Creek?" he asked. "It was as far as my money went," she said honestly, "and the name seemed like a sign." "Do you believe in signs?" "I believe in showing up and seeing what's there," she said. "The sign part is something I decided after." He looked at the creek for a moment. "That's a reasonable philosophy," he said. "What about you?" she asked. "Why here specifically?" He was quiet for a moment. "John Greer," he said. "My partner. He had land here left to him by an uncle. He wrote me after the war and said come out and help him work it, so I came." He paused. "He died 2 years ago. I kept the land because it was mine by then too, I suppose. Not on paper, but in the way that matters." She heard the weight in this and did not try to lift it for him, just acknowledged it with the kind of quiet that is its own form of respect. "I'm sorry about your partner," she said. "He was a good man," Marcus said simply. They walked back as the afternoon light began to angle toward evening, and when they reached the edge of town, Marcus said, with a straightforwardness that cost him nothing at all now, that he would like to do this again, and Sarah said she would like that too. They walked 3 more Sundays before he took her hand, and he did it without thinking, which was the only way he could have done it, reaching for her hand as they came down a rocky part of the bank because the footing was uncertain, and then not letting go when the footing improved. She let the moment pass without comment, which was a form of kindness he recognized and was grateful for. The harvest dance arrived on a Saturday in June that was warm in the easy way of early summer evenings, before the real Texas heat settled in. Clara had been watching the progress of things with the satisfaction of a woman who has correctly read a long novel, and she had, without making any fuss about it, made sure Sarah had a proper dress for the occasion. A deep green wool that Sarah had made herself in the evenings, fitted close through the bodice and full in the skirt, practical and lovely in the way that Sarah tended to be. Marcus arrived at the dance in the kind of clean and pressed state that indicated deliberate effort, and when he came through the door of the community hall and found her standing with Clara and Rose Teller, the look on his face was not subtle. He asked her to dance twice in the first hour, which in Redemption Creek was the social equivalent of a declaration, and by the third dance, the knowing looks passing between the married women of the town had achieved a level of warmth that could have heated the hall by themselves. Between dances, they stood near the open door where the night air came in cool from the hills, and she said things that made him laugh, really laugh, with his head back and his whole face involved in it. And he said things that made her quiet in the thoughtful way she went quiet when something reached her, and the distance between them as the evening progressed became something that could no longer be measured in feet. He walked her back to Clara's boarding house at the end of the evening, and they stood on the porch in the dark and the warm June night, and he said, "Sarah," and stopped, because he had a great many things he wanted to say and was momentarily unable to sort them into an order that made sense. "I know," she said softly. "Do you?" he asked. "I think so," she said, and looked up at him, and he was close enough that she could see the way his expression had entirely given up its habitual careful reserve, and what was underneath it was something she did not have a word for that was simple enough but big enough, and she found she did not need a word for it. He kissed her with the careful intentness of a man who has been waiting for the right thing for a long time, and intends to give it the full attention it deserves, and she kissed him back with the whole of herself, which had always been her only method of doing anything. The following weeks were the kind that exist in memory afterward with a quality of particular light, as if the whole stretch of time was being viewed through clear water. He came to town on Wednesdays now, not just Saturdays. He brought her things he thought she might like. A piece of particularly smooth limestone from the creek that was pale blue-gray and fit perfectly in her hand. A jar of honey from a hive on his property that produced honey with a particular wildflower sweetness. She sent things back with him. A handkerchief she had embroidered for no special reason except that she had been thinking about him while she did it. A piece of cornbread wrapped in cloth because Clara had made extra and it was good, and she knew he mostly cooked for himself. They were careful and deliberate about it in the way of two people who have both had things go wrong before and understand the value of not rushing. But there was also between them a quality of inevitability that neither of them felt the need to argue with. The complication arrived, as complications tended to in Redemption Creek, with a man on a horse. His name was Edmund Gage, and he arrived in town on a Tuesday in July with two companions, and the kind of expensive clothing that does not belong in a working cattle town and knows it. He was 45 years old, heavyset, with the smooth hands and watchful eyes of a man who made money through means that other people did the actually dangerous parts of. He took rooms at the hotel, which had finally opened in June, and he ate dinner at the only restaurant, which was attached to one of the saloons, and he had meetings in those first 2 days with several of the larger landowners in the county. What Edmund Gage wanted was land. Specifically, he wanted the eastern corridor of the hill country along the creek, because a railroad surveyor had come through the previous autumn, and the resulting whisper through certain financial circles was that the rail line being planned for expansion out of San Antonio might run directly through that valley. Land that was currently worth relatively little would become worth a great deal. The running M sat squarely in the middle of the corridor he needed. Marcus had heard these rumors before, in the abstract way that ranch owners in growing territories heard things, and had not thought much of them because a man can go mad running after every rumor in the West, and he had a ranch to manage. But when Edmund Gage came to see him on a Thursday morning, riding out with one of his companions to the running M, and sitting across from Marcus at his kitchen table with a number written on a piece of paper, Marcus understood that the rumor had become a fact. The number was generous, more than generous. It was the kind of number that changed a man's life in a fundamental and permanent way. Marcus listened to Gage's full presentation with the complete attention of a man who is actually thinking and not just waiting for the other person to stop talking. Then he said, "I appreciate you coming out, Mr. Gage. I'll give it serious consideration and get back to you." Which was what a man said when he was not going to say yes immediately, and Gage, who was experienced in these negotiations, recognized it for exactly what it was, which was not a no but was also the beginning of a problem. Marcus told Sarah about it that Wednesday evening, sitting in the parlor of Clara's boarding house with Clara tactfully occupied somewhere else in the building. He laid it out plainly as he did most things and watched her face as he talked. "What do you want to do?" she asked when he finished. "I don't want to sell," he said. "I built that ranch, every fence post, every board in that house." He stopped, and she heard in the pause the thing he was not saying yet, which was also about her, about the future that was taking shape between them in a way neither of them had explicitly named but both of them felt as clearly as the weather. "Then don't sell," she said. "He'll find other ways to pressure," Marcus said. "Men like Gage don't make one offer and go home." He was right about that. Over the following week, two of Marcus's neighboring ranchers were approached with similar offers, and one of them, an older man named Albert Sims who had been struggling since a bad winter 2 years prior, accepted. The other, a younger man named Cal Rivera with a wife and new baby, declined as Marcus had. Gage then began working through legal channels, engaging a lawyer from San Antonio, who arrived with papers that claimed a survey dispute on the eastern boundary of the running M, suggesting that the fencing Marcus had put in 12 years ago encroached on what was technically public land. It was the kind of claim that was difficult to disprove quickly and easy to make loudly, and Sheriff Prout came to Marcus with the papers and the expression of a man who did not believe a word of them but was obligated to convey their existence. "It's harassment dressed up in legal clothing," Marcus said. "That's my assessment," Prout agreed. "But the claim has to be responded to through proper channels, which means a judge, which means San Antonio, which takes time." Marcus's jaw set in the way it set when he was containing something considerable. "How much time?" "Could be months," Prout said. "Gage knows what he's doing." That evening Marcus rode into town in a state that Sarah recognized when he came through Clara's door, not angry in the sharp way but in the deep sustained way that is worse because it has nowhere to go. She sat him down and made him coffee, which was not something she had done before but felt entirely natural, and she sat across from him and listened to all of it. "The claim is false," she said when he finished. "You know that. The sheriff knows that." "Knowing it and proving it before Gage makes the situation untenable are different things," Marcus said. "Do you have any documentation, the original survey, land grant papers?" "At the ranch. I have the original land grant certificate from when I filed with the county, and John's papers from his uncle which transferred to me after he died." "Then we use those," she said. "You need to get them to a lawyer in San Antonio before Gage's lawyer can establish anything. If you can file a counter-documentation before their claim gets heard, you put them on the defensive." Marcus looked at her. "You know about legal processes." "Mrs. Calloway had a lawsuit against her shop for 2 years, Sarah said, from a supplier who claimed she had not paid a bill she absolutely had. I watched the whole thing and I helped her organize her receipts. She won. Documentation, filed quickly and correctly, is everything." He was quiet for a moment, and in the quiet there was something that shifted between them, some additional weight of trust that settled and found its level. "I'd need to ride to San Antonio," he said. "Then go," she said. "I'll still be here when you get back." He was gone for 4 days, and they were 4 days that felt different in Redemption Creek in the particular way that a person's absence reshapes the space they usually occupy. Sarah worked and went about her business and did not spend an excessive amount of time thinking about whether he was all right, mostly because she had enough confidence in his competence to trust him with the task, but also because she was a woman who had learned the difference between worry and faith and had elected for the latter. Clara, over supper the second night, said, "He'll be fine, you know." "I know," Sarah said. "He's a careful man," Clara said. Careful and capable both, which is a rarer combination than it should be. "I know that too," Sarah said, and there was something in her voice that made Clara reach across the table and briefly cover her hand with her own large, warm one, and say nothing more. Marcus returned on a Thursday afternoon with papers from a San Antonio lawyer named George Whitfield, who had reviewed the original land grant documentation and the transfer papers from John Greer's estate, and had filed a full counter-challenge to Gage's boundary claim the same day Marcus walked into his office. Whitfield was a tall, measured man with a gray beard and the careful speech of someone who had spent decades choosing words with the understanding that they had consequences, and he had looked at Marcus's documentation and said, flatly, that Gage's claim was without merit and would not survive a hearing. He rode to the Running M first, to collect some additional correspondence Marcus wanted to include with the documentation, and then came into town to find Sarah. She was in her sewing room when Clara called up to her that Marcus was downstairs, and she came down the stairs with a speed that she did not attempt to moderate, and he was standing in the parlor with his hat in his hand and the look of a man who has successfully done a difficult thing and is now doing the more difficult thing of coming back to the person who matters most to say so. She stopped 2 feet from him and looked at him and said, "Well, filed and counterfiled," he said. "Whitfield says it's solid. Gage will likely withdraw the claim rather than lose a hearing that puts his methods on public record." "Good," she said, and then, because she was Sarah Hale and she did not moderate herself when she meant something, she crossed the remaining 2 feet and put her arms around him, and he was so surprised that he stood still for a half-second before his arms came around her, and he held her with the complete certainty of a man holding the thing that matters most. Clara, from the direction of the kitchen, produced a sound that was either a cough or the world's smallest laugh. Neither of them paid any attention to this. Edmund Gage withdrew his boundary claim 2 weeks later through his San Antonio lawyer without public comment. He left Redemption Creek the following day. Cal Rivera, Marcus's neighboring rancher, came over the following Saturday and shook Marcus's hand for a good 10 seconds without speaking, which in the language of Texas ranchers was roughly equivalent to a detailed speech. The summer deepened. The hill country turned to gold and copper in the afternoons, and the evenings came softer now, the heat releasing into something you could breathe easily. Marcus and Sarah spent Sunday afternoons at the creek still, and Wednesday evenings at Clara's still, and Saturday markets when she was not busy with work. And in the gathered hours of all those times, they built between them something that had the quality of actual architecture, weight-bearing and true. He showed her the ranch in full for the first time on a Saturday in August, riding out together on the horses Clara kept for boarders' use, and she saw the Running M as he had described it, and also as it actually was, which was more beautiful than descriptions allow, for because the land had a quality in the morning light that required presence to understand. The house was solid and square, built from local stone and cedar timber, with a porch that faced the creek hollow and a kitchen that was bigger than the bedroom, because Marcus had built it according to his priorities rather than convention. The bedroom door did not quite hang straight, as he had told her, and she looked at this for a moment and then looked at him, and he was watching her with an expression of such open vulnerability that she touched the side of his face with her hand and said, "I like it." She meant the door, but she also meant everything else, and he understood both meanings, and the look in his eyes was the look of a man who has been carrying something alone for a very long time and has just felt the weight shift. "Sarah," he said, and his voice had the quality of something that had been decided well before the moment but was only now finding its words. "I know I am not a man who says things easily. I've never been. But I need you to know that since you came off that stagecoach in May, everything I thought I understood about what I was building out here has changed into something larger. You're the reason it feels like home instead of just land." She was quiet for a moment, not from uncertainty, but from the full weight of what he had said landing in her completely, filling the places she had kept carefully empty since St. Louis. "Marcus," she said, "I came to Redemption Creek because I had nowhere else to go and not enough money to go farther, and I found the only place I have ever wanted to stay." He kissed her in the doorway of the crooked door bedroom of the house he had built with his own hands, and she kissed him back in the full Sarah Hale way that held nothing back, and the morning light came through the window onto the two of them in that plain good house on the good Texas land, and it was enough. It was more than enough. He asked her to marry him 3 weeks later, on a Sunday afternoon at the creek in the particular late summer light that made the water look like hammered copper. He did not have a ring yet, which he acknowledged with a directness that she found charming, and he said he wanted to ask the question before he had the ring because the question was more important than the jewelry, and he did not want to wait any longer. She said yes before he had fully finished the sentence, which made him laugh with that full whole-face laugh that she had decided early on was one of the best sounds she had ever heard. The ring came from San Antonio, ordered through Pete Haverty's special order book, a simple gold band set with a small turquoise stone the color of the Texas sky on clear days, which was not a conventional choice, but was so entirely the right one for Sarah that Marcus had not for a single moment doubted it. He put it on her finger on a Tuesday evening in Clara's parlor, and Clara cried, which she would have denied vigorously to anyone who asked, and several people who did not ask, blowing her nose on her apron with the firm efficiency of a woman dispatching a weakness. They were married in October, at the church that leaned slightly to the left, on a morning that was perfectly clear and cool in the way of the best Texas autumn days, with a sky so blue it seemed excessive. The pastor, a gentle man named Reverend Holt, who had been in Redemption Creek since the beginning, and had married and buried most of its residents over the years, performed the ceremony with the warm deliberateness of a man who understood that weddings were the serious business of two people staking a claim on something larger than either of them alone. Sarah wore the green wool dress she had made for the harvest dance, altered slightly, and with a collar of cream lace she had made herself in the evenings, and she carried a small bunch of late-season wildflowers that Marcus had picked from the field beside the road on the way into town that morning, and presented to her with the gruff gentleness that was his particular mode of romance. Clara sat in the front pew and did not cry, which required monumental effort. Rose Teller cried enough for several people. Cal Rivera and his wife, Maria, sat 2 rows back with their baby, and Sheriff Prout stood at the back with his arms crossed in the attitude of a man deeply satisfied with a situation but unwilling to display it. Pete Haverty, from his pew near the window, had the look of a man filing something away to tell his wife. When Reverend Holt said the words and Marcus took her hand and spoke his vow with the full quiet weight of a man who does not say things he does not mean, and means this with everything he has, Sarah felt the word home settle into her the way a foundation stone settles, down and down through uncertain earth until it meets solid rock and stops. She spoke her own vow looking directly at him, in the clear, unhesitating voice of a woman who has decided and is at peace with her decision, and his hand tightened on hers in the way it did when he was moved and did not know how else to show it. They moved Sarah's things to the running M that afternoon. Clara helped, and it turned into something between a moving party and a small celebration, with several women from the town appearing with food and opinions about where things should go, and Marcus managing the whole of it with a bemused, patient grace that Sarah cataloged privately as evidence of his fundamental goodness. When everyone had gone and it was just the two of them in the house in the late afternoon, the last of the October light coming orange through the kitchen window, Sarah stood in the kitchen and looked at the honest simplicity of it, the iron stove and the pine table and the window that faced the creek hollow, and felt something complete in herself that she had not felt before, like a sentence reaching its final punctuation. Marcus came in from stabling the horses and found her there, and he looked at her in the kitchen of his house with the particular quality of attention he gave to things he was still unable to fully believe were real, and she said, "It is real, you know." "I know," he said. "I'm just not finished being grateful for it." The first winter of their marriage was the kind of winter that tests the truth of things, not because it was cruel, though the hill country could produce cold that made the bones of a house speak, but because winters on a working ranch are a sustained negotiation with necessity that leaves very little room for the pretenses that sometimes sustain people in easier circumstances. Marcus was in the fields or the barn, or on the range from early light until dark on most days. Sarah managed the house and continued her sewing work, because the women of Redemption Creek had not stopped needing dresses, and because she was a woman who needed work the way she needed air, not out of compulsion, but out of the genuine pleasure of doing something with care and skill. She set up a proper workroom in one of the spare rooms at the ranch, with good light from the south-facing window, and her clients rode out to her now or sent orders through Clara. There were mornings when Marcus came in from the cold with his hands chapped and his face reddened, and she had coffee ready and he sat at the kitchen table, and they talked about the ranch, about the cattle, about the accounts and the spring planning, and these conversations had the quality of two people genuinely engaged in a common project, two intelligences applied to the same problem, and Marcus found in them a satisfaction that went beyond the practical. Because he had managed the running M alone for so long that the simple fact of having someone to think out loud with was its own kind of gift. She learned to ride properly that winter, on a calm gray mare named Dust that Marcus chose for her with the eye of a man who understood both horses and the particular temperament of the woman he had married. Sarah took to it with the determined practicality of a woman for whom learning a skill was always primarily about what the skill allowed her to do, and by February she could ride the ranch boundary alone, which she did on clear afternoons with a pleasure she could not entirely account for except that there was something in the motion of a good horse across open country that answered something in her she had not known was a question. On one of those February afternoons, riding the north fence line, she met for the first time the neighbors on the north side of the running M, a family she had heard about but not yet encountered. They were the Ortega family, Jose and Esperanza Ortega and their 3 children, who ran a small cattle operation and a kitchen garden that Esperanza managed with a near-miraculous skill that produced vegetables in conditions that seemed to argue against it. Jose was a quiet, dark-eyed man about Marcus's age who had been in the county almost as long, and he and Marcus had the easy, practical friendship of men who had helped each other in difficult situations enough times that explanation was no longer required between them. Esperanza Ortega was 32, compact and direct, with black hair and an evaluating gaze that softened to warmth once it had finished its assessment. She looked Sarah over with frank thoroughness when they met at the fence line and then said, "So you are Marcus Turner's wife. He is a good man. He fixed our windmill 2 winters ago and never mentioned it to anyone. Come to supper on Friday, I will make tamales." Sarah went to supper on Friday. The tamales were extraordinary. Esperanza's children, 2 boys and a girl between the ages of 5 and 11, treated Sarah with the straightforward curiosity of children who have not yet learned to disguise what they think. And by the end of the evening, the youngest boy, who was 5 and named Tomás, had fallen asleep against her arm while she sat talking with Esperanza, and she looked down at his small, sleeping weight and felt something move through her that was very clear in its direction. She told Marcus that night, lying awake in the dark while the February wind moved around the house. She said, "I would like us to have children." He was quiet for a moment and then he said, "I was going to bring that up myself. I didn't want to seem like I was rushing you." She turned to look at him in the dark. "How long were you going to wait?" "I don't know," he said, "until it seemed right." "It seems right," she said. "Then we agree," he said, and there was a quality in his voice in the darkness that was entirely undone in the best way, stripped of everything except what was true. By April, she knew she was expecting. She told Marcus on a Wednesday morning, matter-of-factly, over the breakfast table, because she was Sarah Hale, and she did not build to things dramatically when the direct approach was available. She told him and watched his face go through several things very quickly. Surprise, and then something that was not quite disbelief but was close to it. And then something that was simply and completely joy, open and unguarded in a way she had only seen a handful of times, and those times she had stored carefully. He stood up from the table and came around to her side and put his arms around her from behind where she sat, carefully, the way he touched anything fragile, though she was not fragile, and he pressed his face against her hair and said nothing for a moment, and the nothing he said had more content than most speeches. "Are you all right?" he asked, which was the first thing he said, and she had known it would be the first thing. "I am very well," she said. "Stop worrying before you've started." "I will not stop worrying," he said. "That is simply not something I am willing to commit to." She laughed, and he held her a little tighter, and outside the window of the kitchen the April morning was doing exactly what April mornings in the Texas Hill Country are supposed to do, all green and warm and thoroughly convinced of its own promise. Clara Booth, when told, made a sound that was somewhere between a shout and a sob, and then composed herself with speed and dignity and said, "I will knit something. Do not argue with me about this." No one argued with her about this. The pregnancy was, in the practical way that the West required things to be practical, a thing that Sarah accommodated into her life rather than allowing her life to wait on it. She continued her sewing work through the summer, somewhat modified. She continued to ride dust through the spring, less frequently as the summer progressed. She went to church and to the general store and to the Ortegas for supper, and she was present and engaged in the life of the ranch and the town, because she was Sarah Hale and presence was her fundamental mode. Marcus managed the combination of his concern for her and the needs of the ranch with the efficiency of a man who had decided that both things could coexist and had arranged his days accordingly. He came home at midday when he could, a habit he had not previously kept. He asked after her health every morning with the careful casualness of a man who has decided not to be oppressively concerned, but cannot entirely suppress the underlying current of it. He read to her in the evenings, something she had asked him to do, and he had begun shyly, and then discovered he enjoyed, working through a collection of Walter Scott she had brought from St. Louis in the very bottom of her trunk. She asked him once in the long warm evenings of July what he thought it would be like to be a father. He was quiet for a long time, long enough that she wondered if she had asked something too large for the occasion. Then he said, "I think about my own father. He was a steady man. Not always warm, but always steady, and I understood when I was older that the steadiness was its own form of love. I want to be both if that's possible, steady and warm both." "It is possible," she said. "You are already both." He looked at her in the candlelight with the expression that had become her most treasured sight, this open truth on his face that he had learned to stop hiding from her, and he said, "You make it easier to be what I want to be." The summer passed in its full golden abundance, and in late September, on a Tuesday morning when the hill country was just beginning its shift from summer to autumn, Sarah went into labor with the careful no-nonsense attitude she brought to most things, and Clara Booth, who had been staying at the ranch for the past 2 weeks in preparation, sent Marcus out to pace the porch and brought in the midwife, a capable woman named Mrs. Helen Carter, who had delivered more babies in the county than anyone could accurately count. Marcus paced the porch for 4 hours, which felt to him like considerably longer. He was joined after the first hour by Jose Ortega, who had been nearby working a fence line and had been waved over by Clara when she saw him from the window, because she judged correctly that Marcus should not be alone on that porch for 4 hours. Jose sat beside him and they talked about cattle and weather and fencing and nothing at all, which was exactly the right conversation. At just past noon, Clara appeared at the door and said, in a voice that was trying very hard to be calm but was not entirely succeeding, "You have a son, Marcus, and Sarah as well. Come inside." He stood up from the porch steps and he was still for a moment in the autumn sunlight, and whatever was on his face made Jose Ortega look away at the hills for a moment out of a respect for a private thing. Marcus went inside. He found Sarah in the bedroom, sitting up against the pillows with the unhurried composure of a woman who has done something remarkable and is at peace with having done it, holding a small wrapped bundle against her chest. She looked up when he came in, and her face was tired and flushed and the most beautiful thing he had ever seen. He crossed to her and sat on the edge of the bed and looked at the small face in the blanket. "He has your scowl," Sarah said. "Babies always scowl," Marcus said, which was not something he had actually known before this moment. He reached out with one careful finger and touched the back of the baby's hand, and the small fingers moved. Something happened in Marcus Turner's chest at that moment that fundamentally rearranged the furniture, and he recognized it as the feeling of a life expanding into a dimension that had not previously existed. "What do we name him?" Sarah asked. They had discussed names without arriving at a final decision, the way people discuss large questions when they still have time. Marcus had been inclined toward something simple and solid. Sarah had been inclined toward something with meaning. "John," Marcus said. He said it plainly and it did not require explanation, but he gave one anyway. "For John Greer, who brought me here." She looked at him, and the tenderness in her face was the particular kind that comes when someone does exactly the thing you would have hoped for. "John Marcus Turner," she said. "That's his name." The baby was, as babies tend to be, entirely indifferent to the name, but appeared to find the warmth and closeness of his parents' presence satisfactory. He scowled with the focused intensity of a person who has arrived in an unfamiliar place and is conducting a thorough assessment. Clara Booth, from the doorway, permitted herself a single tear, which she dispatched immediately and efficiently with her handkerchief, and then went to make coffee for everyone, because that was what was needed, and she knew exactly what was needed. Little John grew in the way of a child on a working ranch, surrounded by large quiet spaces and the rhythms of land and season and animals, and he had his father's steadiness and his mother's directness, and the combined result was a small person of considerable character who was walking at 11 months and attempting to explain the universe at 14 months in a language that only Tomás Ortega, who was by then 6 and had appointed himself John's primary interpreter, could reliably translate. The running M settled into its fullest version of itself in the years that followed. Marcus expanded the herd carefully, in the methodical way he did everything, and the ranch became known in the county for the quality of its cattle rather than its size. Sarah's sewing work grew into something that required a proper assistant, and she hired a young woman named Flora Sims, Albert Sims' granddaughter, who had a talent for fine work and a hunger to learn that reminded Sarah powerfully of Bess in the St. Louis laundry, and she taught her with the same careful thoroughness, and Flora became an excellent seamstress and a steady presence in the household 2 days a week. Sarah and Esperanza Ortega became the kind of friends that the West produced when it was at its best, the kind that cross all the lines of difference and become something essential. They exchanged recipes and seeds and advice and frustrations, and occasional hard truth with the reciprocal honesty of people who had decided that pretense was a luxury neither of them needed. Esperanza taught Sarah to cook several things that transformed the ranch kitchen. Sarah helped Esperanza expand a small side trade in embroidered goods that Esperanza had been doing quietly into something that earned her real money of her own, independent of the ranch income, which mattered in ways that went beyond money. The injustices of the county were real, and the Ortegas felt them in concrete ways, in the way that the land offices sometimes required extra documentation from Spanish-speaking landowners, in the way that certain men in town spoke to Jose Ortega and not at him, in the small daily frictions of a territory that was still deciding what kind of place it wanted to be. Marcus Turner, who noticed things and who had a strong view of what fairness required, made himself a consistent and sometimes inconvenient presence at county meetings where these things were decided, and he was not eloquent about it, but he was unmovable, which was worth more than eloquence in many practical situations. Sarah did the same in her domain, and the two of them together had an effect that was not dramatic but was steady, which was the kind of effect that outlasts drama. Their daughter arrived 2 years after John, in November, small and fierce from the first moment, with Sarah's brown hair and Marcus's gray eyes and an opinion about everything from the beginning. They named her Clara, without any discussion being required on the subject, and Clara Booth, who came to the ranch the morning after the birth with a large quantity of knitted goods, and a face that she could not quite assemble into its usual practical composure, held the baby for a long time without speaking, and then said, in a voice that was not entirely steady, "Well, I am deeply flattered, and I will deny that to anyone who asks." Young Clara and young John proceeded to develop the kind of sibling relationship that combines genuine affection with a level of competitive argument that would have alarmed their parents more if they had not recognized in it the same stubbornness operating in two different directions. The years in Redemption Creek moved in the rhythm of land and season, marked by the occasions that mark frontier life, by the wet spring that saved the pasture when it needed saving, by the dry summer that tested everyone's patience and the practical ingenuity they had built against exactly that test, by the harvest dances that continued to be the heartbeat of the town's social life, and at which Marcus Turner could now be reliably found on the dance floor more than half the evening. Having discovered through patient encouragement from his wife that he was a better dancer than he had previously allowed himself to be, Pete Haverty's general store got a new floor and a larger storefront, and Pete himself got a junior partner who was his nephew from Dallas, and the nephew had opinions about modern merchandising that Pete tolerated with the patient affection of a man who knows that the young are entitled to their confidence. Sheriff Prout was re-elected 4 times running, which was either a testament to his capabilities or to the fact that nobody else wanted the job, and possibly both simultaneously. Clara Booth remained at her boarding house and remained the operational center of Redemption Creek's social intelligence, and remained the person most accurately described as the woman who had understood everything before it happened, and had the grace not to say so too often. She came to dinner at the Running M every Sunday, which had become the arrangement by quiet mutual agreement, and she sat at the head of Sarah and Marcus's table, not because anyone had assigned her that seat, but because it was simply where she went and where she belonged. And she told stories about the town and its history, and its inhabitants with the combination of wit and warmth and occasional ruthless accuracy that made her both the best dinner companion and the person you absolutely did not want to have formed a wrong impression of you. Sarah and Marcus had 5 good years, and then some harder ones, and then more good years, and the texture of the harder ones was different from what Sarah had expected, not because Marcus was difficult in those times, but because he was consistent in them, showing up every day with the same fundamental intention regardless of circumstances. And this she cataloged as the most important thing, more than romance, more than feeling, though those were present too. This reliability of character that she had recognized in him from the beginning and had built her trust on. They had a second son, Robert, when young John was 5 and Clara was 3, and Robert was a gentle, expansive child who grew up to be interested in everything, in the land and the animals and the books Sarah kept in the parlor, and he had the gift of ease that made people comfortable with him immediately, which was not a gift either of his parents possessed naturally, but which he seemed to have arrived with. The town of Redemption Creek itself grew in the way of Texas towns in that era, carefully at first, and then with more confidence as the cattle trade established itself, and more families came in. The railroad did eventually come, not through the eastern corridor that Edmund Gage had coveted, but along the southern route, which reached a town 12 miles away and made that town the regional hub while Redemption Creek remained itself, manageable and known, a place where people stayed not because there was nowhere else, but because there was something worth staying for. There came a December when John was 9 years old and Clara was 7 and Robert was 4, and all 3 children were old enough to understand Christmas as a thing requiring anticipation, and the Running M house was full of that particular December warmth that is made of fire and pine smell, and the voices of children, and the accumulated weight of years of good things. Marcus had brought a pine tree from the hillside in the wagon, which was not something that everyone did but was something his family did, and the children were decorating it with the items Sarah had made, small fabric stars and paper cut shapes, and a string of dried berry clusters that had been young John's contribution, and that dust the mare had eaten half of before John got them inside. Sarah was in the kitchen making pies, and Marcus came in from stabling the horses with cold on his coat and snowflakes in his dark hair, which was now showing the beginning of gray at the temples, and he stood in the kitchen doorway and watched her at the stove, and she turned and saw him watching. "You look like a man with something on his mind," she said. "I was thinking," he said, "about when you stepped off the stagecoach in May of '74, in that dusty dress." "That was 11 years ago," she said. "I know," he said. She wiped her hands on her apron and crossed the kitchen to him, and he put his arms around her the way he always did, with a sureness that had only deepened over the years into something that felt like the earth itself, and she put her head against his chest and listened to the steady, reliable sound of his heart. "What about it?" she asked. "I looked away," he said. "When you got off the stagecoach, I looked and then I looked away." "I know you did," she said. "Worst decision I almost made," he said. She pulled back enough to look up at him, and his face in the kitchen light was everything it had ever been and more, the contained man with the uncontained feeling underneath, the man who had built something real from nothing and had the grace to share it, her husband, her partner, the father of their children, the person she trusted most completely in the world. "But you didn't," she said. "You crossed the street." "You crossed the room," he said, and she knew what he meant, the way she had turned from the thread rack at Haverty's store, the way she had looked at him directly when most people didn't, the way she had been, from the beginning, someone who crossed toward the things that mattered rather than away from them. "We both did," she said. From the parlor came the sound of young John and Clara conducting a dispute about the correct placement of a paper star that had escalated to a level requiring parental intervention, and Robert's voice floating above theirs saying something conciliatory in his gentle way that was not yet working. Sarah and Marcus stood in the kitchen for one more moment, her head against his chest, his arms around her, the pie warm on the stove and the snow soft against the window and their children loud and real in the next room. Then she said, "You should go separate them before John wins on volume alone." "He gets that from you," Marcus said. "He does not," she said, and the laughter was already in her voice. "He absolutely does," he said, and kissed the top of her head and let her go and went into the parlor, and she could hear his voice shift into the particular gentle authority he used with the children and the sound of the argument de-escalating by degrees. She turned back to the stove and stood for a moment with her hands resting on the counter, and looked out the window at the snow coming down soft and steady in the December dark, and felt the full settled reality of her life in this house, on this land, in this town, its weight and its warmth and its completeness. She had come to Redemption Creek because it was as far as the money would take her. She had stayed because home, when you find it, is not always what you thought you were looking for, and it is always worth more than anything you left behind. In the parlor, Robert had apparently succeeded in his peacemaking, because the argument sounds had given way to the sound of Marcus reading, aloud from a book. John's protests about the star placement apparently settled. Clara settled beside her father with the deep satisfaction of a child being read to, and Robert's small voice asking a question about something in the text. Sarah took the pies from the oven and set them on the counter to cool, and then she untied her apron and went into the parlor to join her family. The fire was burning well, and the pine tree stood in the corner with its paper stars and fabric ornaments, and the surviving berry string catching the firelight. And Marcus looked up when she came in and made room beside him on the settee. And she sat down, and he put his arm around her, and she leaned against his shoulder, and young Clara immediately climbed into her lap with the unconscious certainty of a child who knows where belonging is. Robert went back to his book. John was drawing something at the table with absolute concentration. Marcus continued reading in the warm, steady voice she loved, the words moving through the room like something alive. Outside, the December snow fell on the running M, on the good Texas land, on the limestone and the cedar and the creek that ran clear even in winter, on the fence lines Marcus had built, and the kitchen garden she had planted, and the road between the ranch and Redemption Creek that they had traveled together in all weathers and all seasons for 11 years. And it settled quietly on all of it, on the whole life they had built together, stitch by careful stitch, stone by honest stone. Out of nothing more, and nothing less than two people, who had both been looking for the same thing without knowing the other existed. Clara Booth, in her boarding house on the north side of Main Street, sat by her own fire that same December night with her knitting in her lap, and she was thinking, as she often did in the quiet evenings, about the May morning 11 years ago when a thin, dusty woman had come through her door and sat down at her table and eaten salt pork and cornbread with the focused thankfulness of someone who has been hungry, in several senses, for a long time. She smiled to herself in the firelight and said aloud to no one, or perhaps to someone, "Well, I was right about that one." She always was. The years after that December settled themselves into the long, steady rhythm of a good life fully lived. John grew into a serious and capable young man who had his father's feel for land and his mother's way with words. And at 17, he was already the most reliable hand on the running M, and had begun to talk about whether the ranch might one day be large enough to take on the neighboring section to the south that had come available. Marcus listened to these conversations with the particular pride of a man who recognizes his own best qualities operating in someone younger and better rested. Clara became a young woman of considerable presence who had her mother's directness and her father's steady judgment, and the very particular personal style of someone who has grown up knowing exactly who they are. And she pursued her interest in education with the same single-mindedness her mother had brought to a dress shop in St. Louis, announcing at 15 that she intended to teach school, and informing her parents of this, rather than requesting their opinion, which they gave anyway, which was that this was an excellent plan. Robert remained the gentle peacemaker, becoming a young man who understood animals with an almost wordless sympathy, and who spent hours with the horses and cattle with the same quality of attention Marcus had spent on the land itself. And it was clear by the time he was 12 that Robert's particular gift was with living things, which was, when you considered it, not so different from his mother's gift with people. Esperanza Ortega's embroidery business had grown to the point where she had 2 women working with her and sold goods in San Antonio through a shop there. And she and Sarah sat sometimes in the kitchen of the running M or the Ortega house and talked about the plain fact of this, the fact of women building things that were theirs, and it felt important to both of them in a way that they did not always have words for but understood completely. Jose Ortega and Marcus built a water management system together in the dry year of 1882 that brought creek water to both properties through a shared irrigation channel that took them 3 months and considerable profanity, though the profanity belonged almost entirely to Jose, and became a model that 3 other neighboring ranches adopted in the following years. This was the kind of legacy that does not get written in history books, but is the actual substance of how the West was made livable, not by dramatic solitary acts, but by neighbors solving problems together. Flora Sims, Sarah's assistant, married a carpenter from the next county over and moved 20 miles away, but continued to take special orders from Sarah, and they maintained a working correspondence that was also, gradually, a friendship conducted through letters, and Sarah kept Flora's letters in a box in the workroom desk alongside Bess's single letter from St. Louis, which she had carried in the bottom of her trunk through the whole journey west, and which she had read so many times that the creases were permanent. In the spring of 1885, Clara Booth fell ill, seriously enough that Marcus rode for the doctor in San Antonio, and the weeks that followed were the hardest of Sarah's time in Redemption Creek, not because the outcome was uncertain in the way of sudden catastrophe, but because Clara's illness was the slow kind that requires prolonged witnessing, and Sarah witnessed it with the full present attention she brought to everything, going into town every day, sitting with Clara in the afternoons, managing the practical matters of the boarding house with the help of Clara's longtime cook, a quiet woman named Mabel who had been there for 15 years. Marcus came when he could and sat with them, and he and Clara had the conversations of 2 people who have known each other long enough to dispense with everything except the true things, and he brought her butter from the ranch and wildflowers in a jar because she liked them, and held her hand when she was tired, with the same careful tenderness he had always brought to the things that mattered most. Clara Booth did not die that spring. She recovered, slowly and incompletely, with the determined cantankerousness of a woman who had decided she was not finished, and by late summer she was up and managing her boarding house again, somewhat less robustly than before but managing, and she told anyone who expressed relief at her recovery that she had never had any intention of going anywhere and they could stop making that face. She sat on the porch of the boarding house on a September evening when Sarah came to visit, and the evening light was the long gold of late summer, and she looked at Sarah across the small table where they had set their coffee cups, and she said, "You know, when you came through that door in May of '74 in that dusty dress with your savings in your hem, I thought, there's a woman who knows who she is. I was right about that." "You were right about a great many things," Sarah said. "I was right about most things," Clara said comfortably. They sat in the evening light together and drank their coffee, and the town of Redemption Creek moved around them in its familiar rhythms, and Sarah felt the fullness of all of it, the 11 years of work and love and difficulty and joy, the children who were growing into their own lives. The man at the ranch 4 miles east who was at this moment probably at the kitchen table going over the fall accounts with John and arguing gently about expansion, because Marcus was methodical and John was ambitious, and they were both right in different ways. The land itself, the cedar and limestone and clear creek water, the whole particular weight and warmth of a life that had been built carefully and with intention. "Clara," she said. Said Clara Booth. "Thank you," Sarah said, "for the salt pork and the cornbread and the sewing room and the harvest dance and all the rest of it." Clara was quiet for a moment, which was not her usual mode. Then she said in a voice that was as close to soft as Clara Booth's voice ever got, "Thank you for showing up. Some people the West takes everything from. Some people it gives everything to. The difference is usually about the person, not the place." Sarah looked at the evening light on the hills and thought about a stagecoach and a dusty dress, and a man on the other side of a street who had looked away, and then thought better of it. She thought about the creek in spring, and a kitchen with a crooked door, and a ring with a turquoise stone the color of the sky, and 3 children who were the specific irreplaceable people they were because of every choice she and Marcus had made together. "I think we're both right about that," she said. Clara Booth made the sound that was not quite a laugh and not quite a sigh, and was entirely Clara, and they sat together in the warm September evening until the light was gone, and the stars came out over the hill country, thick and bright and entirely indifferent to time, the way they had been over that land for longer than anyone alive could account for, and would continue to be long after all of them were gone. And Sarah looked up at them from the porch of the boarding house with the quiet full heart of a woman who has arrived, finally and completely, at the right place. She rode home to the running M in the dark, on Dust who was old now and gray at the muzzle but still steady and willing, and the night air was warm and smelled of cedar and grass and the end of summer, and the stars were overhead the whole way. The house was lit from within, warm rectangles of yellow light in the dark, and as she rode up the last stretch of the road she could see through the kitchen window Marcus at the table with the accounts and the lamp, and the familiar shape of him, the set of his shoulders, the way he bent over the papers with his full attention, was the most welcome sight in the world. She stabled Dust and went inside. He looked up when she came through the door, and his face did the thing it always did, this particular settling, this arriving, as if her presence completed some arrangement that had been approximate until then, and he said, "How's Clara?" "Better than she claims to be, worse than she was," Sarah said. "She's Clara." "She always will be," he said, and pushed back his chair, and she came to him, and he put his arms around her where she stood, and they were still together for a moment in the warm kitchen with the lamp burning, and the accounts spread on the table, and outside the dark Texas night with its infinite stars. Upstairs, their children slept in their various configurations of childhood dreaming, young John methodical and serious even in sleep, Clara fierce and full of intention even at rest, Robert gentle and deep, breathing with the ease of children who know they are safe. And Marcus Turner held his wife in the kitchen of the house he had built with his own hands, in the good life they had built together from next to nothing, in the town with the name that had turned out to be true, and Sarah Hale, who had once been a woman with $40 in a hem and nowhere to be, was entirely home. The crooked bedroom door stood as it had always stood, slightly less than perfect, entirely sufficient, a monument to the fact that a thing does not have to be faultless to be true, and to the particular truth that the right door, hung with intention and good faith, is the only kind that actually keeps the weather out and lets the light in. Outside, the stars kept their own long, patient watch, and the creek ran clear in the dark toward the hills, and Redemption Creek slept and dreamed its small western dream, and the running M sat quiet and whole in the middle of it all, as it would for a very long time to come.